Voices in the Dark. The disturbing tale of Hollow Creek. Hollow Creek was a place most people would never find unless they were lost. Tucked away at the end of a winding dirt road and nestled between dense forests and steep hills, the small town seemed more like a forgotten relic from a distant time than a part of the modern world. The air there always seemed a little colder, the shadows a little longer, and the wind carried with it whispers that made even the bravest visitor shiver. For years, Hollow Creek had been home to only a handful of residents, most of them descendants of the original settlers who had arrived in the mid-1800s. They were a close-knit and secretive bunch, rarely welcoming strangers and even more rarely leaving their isolated town. And for as long as anyone could remember, Hollow Creek had lived under the shadow of a chilling mystery, one that the locals refused to speak about in the light of day. But at night, when the fires were burning low and the darkness crept in, you could hear the older folks talk in hushed tones about the voices in the dark. It was said that Hollow Creek was cursed, haunted by the spirits of the men and women who had died under mysterious circumstances many decades ago. The stories varied depending on who you asked, but they all centered around a single event that took place in 1892, the year when the town's population had abruptly dropped from over 100 residents to fewer than 50 in the span of a few months. People disappeared, they said. Not just one or two, but entire families. Some were found later, deep in the woods, their bodies twisted and broken, while others simply vanished, leaving behind only faint traces of their lives. The town's folk tales described strange occurrences before the disappearances. The faint, disembodied voices that would echo through the trees at night, calling out to anyone who would listen. Some said they heard the voices in their homes, whispering their names as they lay in bed. Others heard them while walking through the woods, the voices luring them deeper into the darkness with promises of hidden treasures or lost loved ones. And for those who followed the voices, it was said they were never seen again. For more than a century, the mystery remained unsolved, the memories of the lost families fading into folklore. Hollow Creek continued its slow decline, with only a handful of residents clinging stubbornly to the land that had claimed so many lives. But the voices never stopped. Every once in a while, a new resident or visitor would mention hearing something strange at night, something just out of reach. The locals would exchange knowing glances and tell them not to listen, to never follow the sound. It wasn't until a group of curious outsiders arrived in Hollow Creek in the fall of 2023 that the true horror of the town's dark history would be revealed. Claire Parker was a journalist with a passion for the paranormal. She'd made a name for herself covering strange and unexplained phenomena, often venturing into remote areas to uncover hidden truths about haunted places and forgotten towns. When she stumbled upon a reference to Hollow Creek while researching another story, she was immediately intrigued. The town's eerie history, coupled with the repeated mentions of strange voices, was too tantalizing to ignore. With her cameraman, Tom, and her sound engineer, Michael, Claire set out for Hollow Creek. She'd contacted a few of the remaining residents ahead of time and had been met with reluctant but polite responses. The people there didn't seem eager to talk about the town's past, but they hadn't outright refused her request for an interview either. It was a start. When the team arrived in Hollow Creek, the first thing that struck Claire was how silent the town was. There were no birds singing in the trees, no rustling of leaves or buzzing of insects. The only sound was the faint whistle of the wind as it passed through the narrow streets and abandoned houses. The few residents they encountered, mostly elderly, watched them with wary eyes, their expressions a mix of suspicion and resignation. Claire's first interview was with Martha Collins, an elderly woman who had lived in Hollow Creek her entire life. Martha had been just a child when the last major wave of disappearances occurred, but she remembered the stories well. "They come at night," Martha said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The voices, they call to you, and if you're not careful, you'll go to them, just like all the others." Claire leaned forward, intrigued. "What do the voices say?" Martha's eyes darkened. "They say whatever they need to say to get you to follow them. They'll sound like someone you know, someone you trust. They'll promise you things, money, love, whatever you desire. But it's all lies. Once you follow them into the woods, you're never seen again." Tom and Michael exchanged uneasy glances as Martha spoke. The old woman's words were chilling, but Claire remained skeptical. There had to be an explanation, some kind of logical reason for the disappearances and the stories of voices. That night, as the team settled into their rented cabin on the outskirts of town, they decided to conduct an experiment. Michael set up his sound equipment around the perimeter of the property, hoping to capture any strange noises that might occur after dark. Claire and Tom reviewed their notes, preparing for the next day's interviews as the hours passed and the night deepened. The oppressive silence of Hollow Creek seemed to close in around them. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like a distant scream. Claire shivered and pulled her jacket tighter around her, but she refused to admit that the town was getting to her. Around midnight, Michael suddenly froze, his eyes wide as he listened to the feed from his headphones. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Tom and Claire exchanged confused looks. "Hear what?" Claire asked. Michael pointed toward the edge of the woods. "Their voices. I swear I heard someone calling my name." They all listened in silence, straining to hear something, anything that might explain what Michael had heard. And then, faintly at first but growing louder, they heard it too. A soft, melodious voice drifting through the trees, calling out to them. "Claire!" Her heart raced. The voice was unmistakable, her mother's voice, clear as day. But that was impossible. Her mother had died years ago. "Claire, come here. I need you." Claire stood, her legs trembling as the voice grew more insistent, tugging at her memories and emotions. She took a step toward the woods, but Tom grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "Don't," he warned. "You heard what Martha said. It's not real." But the voice continued, growing more desperate. "Claire, please." She wrenched her arm free from Tom's grip and took another step toward the dark forest. The pull was undeniable, like a magnetic force drawing her in. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. Shadowy figures moving between the trees, their eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. Tom and Michael were shouting at her, but their voices seemed distant, muffled. The only thing she could focus on was the voice of her mother, calling her, begging her to come closer. Suddenly, there was a sharp crack in the woods, followed by a blood-curdling scream. The spell was broken. Claire stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest as the figures in the trees vanished into the night. "What was that?" Michael gasped, his face pale. "What the hell just happened?" Claire shook her head, trying to make sense of what she had just experienced. It was my mother's voice," she whispered, her throat dry. "But she's dead. It can't have been real." For the rest of the night, none of them slept. The voices continued to call to them, growing more insistent as the hours dragged on. But they didn't dare venture into the woods. They stayed inside the cabin, huddled together, waiting for dawn to break. When morning finally arrived, Claire made the decision to leave Hollow Creek. The mystery of the town was no longer something she wanted to uncover. There were forces at work there that she couldn't explain, things that defied logic and reason. As they packed their equipment and prepared to leave, Martha Collins appeared at the cabin door, her eyes filled with sorrow. "You heard them, didn't you?" she asked quietly. Claire nodded, her voice barely audible. "Yes, we heard them." Martha sighed. "You were lucky. Most people don't make it through the night once the voices come for them. But you listened to your friends. You didn't follow them." As the team drove away from Hollow Creek, the weight of the night's events still hung heavy in the air. They had come seeking answers, but all they had found were more questions, and the unsettling truth that some mysteries were better left unsolved. And behind them, deep in the shadowy woods of Hollow Creek, the voices continued to whisper, waiting for the next person foolish enough to listen.